Writers series, made possible by an endowment from the Bankhead Foundation, the Program in Creative Writing, the Department of English, and the College of Arts and Sciences. Thanks to Daniel Urban and Gretchen Winger and the Book Arts Program for the lovely keepsake commemorating this evening's reading. And thanks as well to John McGaugh of the Soup Store for making the readers' books available for purchase in the lobby. The next reading will be by the fiction writers M.T. Anderson and Aldo Alvarez on Thursday, April 8th in 205 Smith Hall at 7:30 p.m. Following tonight's reading, there will be a reception at the home of Wendy Rawlings and Joel Brower. Maps are available on the book table, and as always, please BYOB. Charles Simic will hold the question and answer period tomorrow at noon in 301 Morgan Hall. If you would like to receive email reminders of upcoming readings, please add your name and email address to the list on the book table. The speakers in Charles Simic's poems can be impolite. They eavesdrop, they stare, they rubberneck without flinching. And it is exactly this bad habit of looking at the world and all its graceless misery that astonishes me so much when reading these poems. Whether it's a clothesline hung with bloody and bullet-holed garments, or some small bird trapped by a cat, we find ourselves fixed in the same gape-mouthed gawk as the speaker. Sometimes we can't help ourselves, like the speaker in Simic's poem, A Letter, who admits, "I went to visit my friend Bob, who said to me, 'We reach the real by overcoming the seduction of images.' I was overjoyed until I realized such abstinence will never be possible for me. I caught myself looking out the window." Other times, the speakers force themselves into purposeful blindness, as in history when one asks, "Why not close my eyes now, before the late world news and weather?" Hopefully, he won't, because we need his eyes open in order to follow his gaze. As Simic explains in his essay, Verbal Image, the alchemy of turning what is visible to us into what is visible to others is what all the arts, and I would say these poems too, are about. According to Helen Vendler, perceptions and shattered memory are Simic's substitutes for belief. He is modern to that degree, but nostalgia for some unknown ancient coherence tinges his modernity. Indeed, Simic speakers seem poised to decipher the codes of our bleak landscapes in an attempt to cobble together some meaning. A person sleeping on a park bench becomes a hieroglyph, and crows open their wings to make two large algebraic X's. But these unknowns are not to be solved with a single answer, but rather result in complicated and empty sets. The ambiguity that marks these poems is evident even in Simic's use of color. There are gray days, gray blankets, gray evenings and centuries. Even the rain is the color of pencil lead. Simic's books are filled with juxtapositions as well, not least of which is the simultaneous impulse to claim the self and to efface it. In Babylon, he writes, "Every time I prayed, the universe got bigger and I got smaller." The more we look, the less we can measure up. Which is not to say that these poems are without hope. After all, the smaller we shrink, the more grand the world grows and the more potent the antidote of wonder becomes. Happiness, he says in Romantic Sonnet, "You are the bright red lining of the dark winter coat grief wears inside out." At the end of Babylon, Simic goes on to write, "My wife almost stepped on me. I saw her huge legs rising to dizzying heights. The hair between them glistened like a god's beard. She looked Babylonian. I'm getting smaller every minute," I yelled, but she could not hear me among the winged lions and ziggurats, the mad astrologers of her painted eyes. With more than 16 volumes of poetry, 5 books of essays, a memoir, and numerous books of translations to his name, Charles Simic is easily one of the most prolific writers of our time. He's also one of our most decorated. In 1990, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The World Doesn't End, Prose Poems, and has been the recipient of fellowships from the NEA and the Guggenheim, MacArthur, and Fulbright Foundations. This past April, he published Voices at 3 a.m., his book of new and selected poems. And so, without further ado, please welcome one of my favorite poets, Mr. Charles Simic.
Thank you. I mean, that's a really very nice introduction. It's always amazing when somebody quotes lines that one has written, because I never read my books, so I'm always surprised or cringe or delighted by when somebody quotes lines that I've written back to me in an introduction or a review. What I'm going to do is I have a book of selected poems, 1963, 2003, coming out in England. So I'll give you a little sort of a sampling of things from over the years. And but to start, I guess I'll go to this. The World Doesn't End. This book of so-called prose poems. A book where I have very short prose things, minus titles. The type is very large to disguise how puny these things are. They were never called prose poems, because when I wrote them, I absolutely had no interest in calling them anything. I mean, I didn't write them consecutively. I wrote them over the years, and I mean, some of them I wrote because I mean, I can remember, like, for example, the first few that I'll read. I was writing a memoir from one of these reference books. They said, why don't you write a kind of an account of your early life? And I wanted to be extremely accurate, to remember everything correctly, the name of my teachers in grade school and years, and, for the sake of my children. But this is extremely boring, because to put this down, and so I kept kind of inventing more interesting versions of my life. I mean, the great thing about, being a poet or a novelist, you can lie, invent things, but if you're writing, a memoir like that for a reference book, you kind of have to be accurate. And, so anyway, I'll just read a few of these things, and as I say, they have no titles, and they're very difficult to find, too, in the book, because there's nothing to find them by. Anyway, here we go. I was stolen by the gypsies. My parents stole me right back. Then the gypsy stole me again. This went on for some time. One minute I was in the caravan suckling the dark tit of my new mother. The next I sat at a long dining room table eating my breakfast with a silver spoon. It was the first day of spring. One of my fathers was singing in the bathtub. The other one was painting a live sparrow, the colors of a tropical bird. We were so poor, I had to take the place of the bait in the mousetrap. All alone in the cellar, I could hear them pacing upstairs, tossing and turning in their beds. These are dark and evil days, the mouse told me as he nibbled my ear. Years passed. My mother wore a cat fur collar, which she stroked until its sparks lit up the cellar. As I said, I didn't have a name for these things, and I wanted to publish it with a small publisher, but then I showed them to my regular publisher, and they said, "We'll do it," and everything was nice. And then in the last minute, after I saw the proofs, they kind of emergency calls. What do we call this thing? What do you mean? He says, what do you call it? Nothing. Call it the World Doesn't End. He says, we can't call it that. I mean, what do you put it in a bookstore under? What? I mean, is it prophecy? So I said, well, I guess we'll have to call them prose poems. Everybody knows the story about me and Dr. Freud, says my grandfather. We were in love with the same pair of black shoes in the window of the same shoe store. The store, unfortunately, was always closed. There'd be a sign, death in the family, or back after lunch. But no matter how long I waited, no one would come to open. Once I caught Dr. Freud there, shamelessly admiring the shoes. We glared at each other before going our separate ways, never to meet again. Actually, they're not all, pseudo-biographical or autobiographical. This is written after, finding out what terrific education Emily Dickinson had in the little school she attended in before she kind of bugged out. They really had, unbelievable stuff for grade school education in New England in 1830s, 1840s. Kind of stuff today, people would be just appalled, that such stuff was like algebra given to, little young ladies, 10-year-old kids, 11-year-old kids, and unthinkable, right? Ghost stories written as algebraic equations. Little Emily at the blackboard is very frightened. The X's look like a graveyard at night. The teacher wants her to poke among them with a piece of chalk. All the children hold their breath. The white chalk squeaks once among the plus and minus signs, and then it's quiet again. Let me see. Yeah, as I said, it's very difficult to find anything, but I will find it. Here we go. My guardian angel is afraid of the dark. He pretends he's not, sends me ahead, tells me he'll be along in a moment. Pretty soon I can't see a thing. This must be the darkest corner of heaven, someone whispers behind my back. It turns out her guardian angel is missing too. It's an outrage, I tell her. The dirty little cowards leaving us all alone. And of course, for all we know, I might be 100 years old already, and she just a sleepy little girl with glasses. One more. This one actually is the oldest one, if I can find it. I think this was written in, the first part, the event occurs in the fall of 1958 in Greenwich Village, in a rooming house on Waverly Place off 6th Avenue. And I had the beginning, but I didn't know where to go next for, I don't know, 20 years? Someone shuffles by my door muttering, "Our goose is cooked." Strange. I have my knife and fork ready. I even have the napkin tied around my neck, but the plate before me is still empty. Nevertheless, someone continues to mutter outside my door regarding a certain hypothetical, allegedly cooked goose that he claims is ours in common. All right. It's a poem called Prodigy. I played very good chess when I was young. I mean, between the ages of 6 and 12, and then I lost all interest in chess. Well, almost all interest. Now I still play chess, but now I play with against a computer that can beat all the grandmasters. And I think I played about, I don't know, countless games, maybe say 50, 60 games. And I'd drawn 3 times, and every other time I lost. Because it doesn't make mistakes. It's like playing God. And people say, how can you do this? And I say, I love it. I'm just, something that's just pure perfection. And I can anticipate all my little guiles, all my little, ruses and so forth. It also takes into account all my little weaknesses, knows my little moves, and knows how I like to go, open the game. Wonderful thing. But anyway, this is going back to Yugoslavia, and when I was born in 1938. And I didn't realize how well I played chess until much later. At the height of my game, I could beat all the grown-ups in my neighborhood in downtown Belgrade. The war was on, the bombs were falling, and the Germans were leaving, the Russians were coming, and there were a lot of aggravations in life. And on the top of that, to have like, a 10-year-old kid, 9-year-old kid, beat you at chess. I mean, I was frequently insulted and told awful things. So this poem is, that's it. I mean, it just basically tells the story of that. One little thing that kind of became a problem later on, a strange problem for translators. I mentioned a Roman graveyard, and everybody assumed that it was a Roman Catholic graveyard, but it really was, Belgrade was a part of ancient Rome, so Rome, there was a place where Romans had a graveyard. I mean, there wasn't really any tombs there or anything like that. Occasionally a Roman brick would come up, and, kids loved that. They were kind of funny shaped bricks, terrific for throwing at somebody's head, So, that's, I'm sort of, I just said that because I was close by. And, anyway, Prodigy. I grew up bent over a chessboard. I loved the word endgame. All my cousins looked worried. It was a small house near a Roman graveyard. Planes and tanks shook its window panes. A retired professor of astronomy taught me how to play. That must have been in 1944. In the set we were using, the paint had almost chipped off to black pieces. The white king was missing and had to be substituted for. I'm told, but do not believe, that summer I witnessed men hung from telephone poles. I remember my mother blindfolding me a lot. She had a way of tucking my head suddenly under her overcoat. In chess, too, the professor told me, the masters play blindfolded, the great ones on several boards at the same time. All right, now I'm going to jump in time to New Hampshire, New England, where I, to my infinite astonishment, moved in 1973. I still spend a lot of time in New York because I have family in New York City, but I'm a city boy and never imagined that I would live, anywhere else but some city. And but I ended up in a little village in New Hampshire. I must say, before I went there, I had the vaguest idea where New Hampshire was. I mean, I knew it was up there where Maine is and Vermont, but, you know, I never took a close look. When I got there, what was sort of remarkable, these sort of mill towns in Maine and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, all the mills closed. I mean, there were shoe factories, and all the textile had gone out, I mean, out of business decades before, but it was leather, mostly leather, and these places were awful looking towns. I mean, were, you know, huge, beautiful 19th century mills, you know, red brick and windows broken and unemployed, you know, drunks, you know, 10 o'clock in the morning, you know, staggering down boarded up main streets, and so that was a very interesting kind of time. Also, Vietnam War, of course, was on, you know, dragging on. So this is a poem from those days. It's called Toward Nightfall. It's dedicated to Don Hall and Jane Kenyon, late Jane Kenyon. And something else over here about this poem. What got it going is an article in a literary journal where a fellow argued that a tragedy was impossible to write anymore, because in order to have tragedy, you have somebody, you know, of elevated stature, a really, real noble figure who falls. But today, you know, everybody's sort of a creep, and, you know, I didn't say it that way. I mean, they're all flawed, and they're already, to begin with, you know, I mean, as they would say, problematic, you know. So, I mean, this annoyed the hell out of me, because, I mean, you know, casualties in the war, people dying, families miserable, you know, you see people in places like in some of these mill towns, in addition to unemployment, you see veterans, you know, hopping around in one leg, you know, on crutches, and, you know, so there's no tragedy. So anyway, that's in it. Toward Nightfall. The weight of tragic events on everyone's back, just as tragedy in the proper Greek sense was thought impossible to compose in our day. There were scaffolds, makeshift stages, puny figures on them like small, indistinct animals caught in the headlights crossing the road way ahead. In the gray twilight, they went unhesitating on the verge of a huge, starless autumn night. One could have been in the back of an open truck, hunkering because of the speed and chill. One could have been walking with a sidelong glance at the many troubling shapes the bare trees made, like those about to shriek, but finding themselves unable to utter a word now. One could have been in one of these dying mill towns inside a small, dim grocery when the news broke. One would have drawn near the radio was the one many months pregnant who serves there at that hour. Was there a smell of spilled blood in the air, or was it that other, much finer scent of fear, the fear of approaching death one met on the empty street? Monsters on movie posters, too, prominently displayed. Then, 6 factory girls, arm in arm, laughing as if they'd been drinking. At the very least, one could have been one of them. The one with a mouth painted bright red who feels out of sorts, for no reason, very pale. And so, excusing herself, vanishes where it says, rooms for rent, and immediately goes to bed, fully dressed, only to lie with eyes open, trembling despite the covers. It's just a bad chill, she keeps telling herself, not having seen the papers, which the landlord has the dog bring from the front porch. The old man never learned to read well, and so reads on in that half-whisper and in that half-light verging on the dark about that day's tragedies, which supposedly are not tragedies in the absence of figures endowed with classic nobility of soul. There's no water. Anybody has any? A sip of. Oh, it's over here. right, now New York City. I have a lot of poems about New York City because I lived in New York City on and off since 1954. And well, first this poem, I think, Shelley. Shelley being the great romantic British poet. I had read Shelley before this particular day, but on this day that I described this, I thought he was the greatest poet who ever lived. I mean, this would happen to me from time to time. This is like 1958, fall 1958. I had moved from Chicago that summer by myself, came to the city. I always wanted to live in New York again, and I never figured out that I'd be lonely because it just didn't cross my mind. I didn't know anybody in a city of 12 million or whatever, 15, whatever it was then, I don't know. So I was kind of, lonely, but I didn't want to go back to Chicago because all my friends told me, why do you want to go to New York? You got all these friends here, you had a job, and I said, New York is so much more fun. So, to go back to Chicago and say, I was wrong, I miss you guys, impossible, unthinkable, right? So anyway, the lines of Shelley's here, I was going to reread Shelley, to put him in quotation marks, but I kind of remembered them because I taught Shelley later on. But I never got around to do it, so I left them the way they were, just kind of came to me. You have to read a lot of Shelley to, to get it right. Some of them are obviously from famous poems, but some of them not so obvious, but anyway, Shelley. Poet of the dead leaves, driven like ghosts, driven like pestilence-stricken multitudes. I read you first one rainy evening in New York City, in my atrocious Slavic accent, saying the mellifluous verses from a battered, mud-stained volume I had bought earlier that day in a second-hand bookstore on 4th Avenue, run by initiate of the occult masters. The little money I had being almost spent, I walked the streets, my nose in the book. I sat in a dingy coffee shop with last summer's dead flies on the table. The owner was an ex-sailor who had grown a huge hump on his back while watching the rain, the empty street. He was glad to hear me sit and read. He'd refill my cup with a liquid dark as river Styx. Shelley spoke of a mad, blind, dying king, of rulers who neither see, nor feel, nor know, of graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. I too felt like a glorious phantom going to have my dinner in a Chinese restaurant I knew so well. It had a 3-fingered waiter who would bring my soup and rice each night without ever saying a word. I never saw anyone else there. The kitchen was separated by a curtain of glass beads which clicked faintly whenever the front door opened. The front door opened that evening to admit a pale little girl with glasses. The poet spoke of the everlasting universe of things, of gleams of a remoter world which visit the soul in sleep, of a desert peopled by storms alone. The streets were strewn with broken umbrellas which looked like funereal kites this little Chinese girl might have made. The bars of MacDougall Street were emptying. There had been a fist fight. A man leaned against a lamppost, arms extended as if crucified, the rain washing the blood off his face. In a dimly lit side street where the sidewalk shone like a ballroom mirror at closing time, a well-dressed man without any shoes asked me for money. His eyes shone. He looked triumphant, like a fencing master who had just struck a mortal blow. How strange it all was, the world's raffle, that dark October night. The yellowed volume of poetry with its splendors and glooms, which I studied by the light of storefronts, drugstores, and barber shops. afraid of my small windowless room, cold as a tomb of an infant emperor. Another New York poem. There's a whole area of New York, I mean, it was called Chelsea and now it's called Soho, where until, I guess, early 60s, mid 60s, they had all these sort of factories, little factories. I mean, you would go into these buildings, take the elevator, which usually was a kind of a freight elevator, and you'd see as it opened on various floors, you see people working in some kind of machines, you know, making, you know, ridiculous things like keychains, bat toys, you know. I mean, there were all sorts of these things that later on, you know, was manufactured someplace else. They had to be made, you know. Book curtains, I don't know, you know, rods, who knows, I don't know. But they were all teeming. I mean, there were just these places that were teeming with activity and people working, and then all of a sudden, especially that area now called Soho, which is, you know, consists of all these pricey lofts and, you know, that cost millions of dollars, all of a sudden got abandoned. And if you walk there, you know, 6 o'clock at night on a weekday, you know, you're walking, say, from China, if you know where Chinatown in New York is, coming back through that area, it's deserted, empty, dark, not a single light. So it was a very cheap place to, you know, to get, you know, a loft or whatever you call these places. Then, I mean, I don't think they were called lofts. It was kind of spooky and scary. Anyway, the poem, Factory. The machines were gone, and so were those who worked them. A single high-backed chair stood like a throne in all that empty space. I was on the floor, making myself comfortable for a long night of little sleep and much thinking. An empty birdcage hung from a steam pipe. In it, I kept an apple and a small paring knife. I placed newspapers all around me on the floor so I could jump at the slightest rustle. It was like the scratching of a pen, the silence of the night writing in its diary. Of rats who came to pay me a visit, I had the highest opinion. They'd stand on 2 feet as if about to make a polite request on a matter of great importance. Many other strange things came to pass. Once a naked woman climbed on the chair to reach the apple in the cage. I was on the floor watching her go on tiptoe, her hand fluttering in the cage like a bird. On other days, the sun peeked through dusty window panes to see what time it was. But there was no clock. Only the knife in the cage glinting like a mirror, and the chair in a far corner where someone once sat facing the brick wall. I guess I'll do one more New York poem from the same period. I wrote these poems not when, in 58. I wrote them in, I wrote them, I guess, in the 80s, late 80s? Yeah, something like that, mid to late 80s. And I just sort of remember that period, a period where nothing much happened. I mean, I just, went around moping most of the time. I saw myself as a character in somebody else's life or a book or life or just, so I was delighted to kind of recall some of these events. And this poem is called Paradise, and one of those sort of hot New York summer days. And there's a neighborhood mentioned here, Hell's Kitchen. That's in the 40s, on the part of the 50s. West Side, 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue. It used to be an Irish neighborhood, and really a tough neighborhood in those days. Dangerous neighborhood. Paradise. In a neighborhood once called Hell's Kitchen, where a beggar claimed to be playing Nero's fiddle while the city burned in midsummer heat, where a lady barber who called herself Cleopatra wielded the scissors of fate over my head, threatening to cut off my ears and nose, where a man and a woman went walking naked in one of the dark side streets at dawn. I must be dreaming, I told myself. It was like meeting a couple of sphinxes. I expected them to have wings, bodies of lions, him with his wildly tattooed chest, her with her huge dangling breasts. It happened so quickly and so long ago. You know that time just before the day breaks when one yearns to lie down on cool sheets in a room with shades drawn. The hour when the beautiful suicides lying side by side in the morgue get up and walk out into the first light. The curtains of cheap hotels flying out of windows like seagulls, but everything else quiet. Steam rising out of the subway gratings. Bodies glistening with sweat. Madness, you might even say paradise. All right, now New Hampshire. I have a lot of poems about New Hampshire, but a lot of poems about snow. But this is not about snow. It's about a country fair, a place called Deerfield, New Hampshire. There's Deerfield, Massachusetts, but this is Deerfield, New Hampshire. Tiny place that has a huge agricultural fair, in addition to everything else, that you have at a fair. But, I mean, the very serious stuff about, people bring the largest, rooster in New England, 6 feet tall, and, just peculiarities of farm life and the kind of stuff that locals just love to look at. And so this poem called Country Fair. If you didn't see the six-legged dog, it doesn't matter, we did. And he mostly lay in the corner. As for the extra legs, one got used to them quickly and thought of other things, like what a cold, dark night to be out at the fair. Then the keeper threw a stick, and the dog went after it, on 4 legs, the other 2 flapping behind, which made one girl shriek with laughter. She was drunk, and so was the man who kept kissing her neck. The dog got the stick and looked back at us, and that was the whole show. At some point, and I think it was in the 90s or when I wrote this poem, I don't know, I don't remember when I wrote this poem, was it in the 80s or the 90s? But I noticed something very obvious. Now that we're beginning to use batteries for watches and clocks, and that there were no more clocks ticking, less and less. There was a time, of course, there was a time when all the timepieces, made noise as the time elapsed. If you can't sleep at night, you hear the clock and you want to go nuts. All the clocks in the house. I mean, that was a kind of a standard thing in movies in the 30s and 40s and 50s when somebody's going nuts, you know, has to make a huge decision, you know, can't decide who to kill, you know, themselves or, you know, somebody else, and, you know, the ticking of the clock gets louder and louder and louder and louder, you know. But all of a sudden, you know, none of that stuff. I used to have a railroad watch that I bought for $2 in Chicago in the 50s that I loved. And, you know, it just always worked. I mean, it was like, you know, you just had to wind it, of course. But, and I always used to bring it to class until one time one student who got a little tipsy, not in class, but outside class, told me that they can't stand the ticking of that clock. And I realized it really had a really ominous, nasty, loud tick. So, that's the subject. The clocks of the dead. One night I went to keep the clock company. He had a loud tick after midnight, as if it were uncommonly afraid. It's like whistling past a graveyard, I explained. In any case, I told him I understood. Once there were clocks like that in every kitchen in America. Now the factory's windows are all broken. The old man and night shift are in Caron's boat. The day you stop, I said to the clock, the little wheels they keep in reserve will have rolled away into many hard-to-find places. Just thinking about it, I forgot to wind the clock. We woke up in the dark. How quiet the city is, I said. Like the clocks of the dead, my wife replied. Grandmother, on the wall, I heard the snows of your childhood begin to fall. A little poem called Transport. One of Emily Dickinson's favorite words, transport. She was talking about transport, you know, kind of, not ecstasy, but, you know, some kind of, people say, you know, she was guzzling all that belladonna and taking other kinds of, you know, those medicinal things that they used to take in the 19th century, supposedly good for you tonics, you know, which were like stronger than martinis. But whatever, transport, she liked that word, transport. So that's the title, Transport. In the frying pan on the stove, I found my love and me naked. Chopped onions fell on our heads and made us cry. It's like a parade, I told her, confetti when some guy reaches the moon. Means of transport, she replied obscurely while we fried. Means of transport. Let's see, what am I doing time-wise? All right. Okay. Here is another poem. It doesn't happen in New England, but it's Ghosts. It's called Ghosts. And when I live in New Hampshire, I mean, people always, you know, in old houses, they see ghosts, and I mean, I sort of, people I trust, I mean, I know they're not, you know, I don't have a screw loose or anything, you know, but, and I've been in situations where, you know, somebody goes upstairs, there was a house, Russell Bankston always had this house where there was an old guy, you know, in a room upstairs, like, where you had to go to the bathroom upstairs. And so you would pass this room, and there was always an old guy there who was kind of, you know, behind his door, ghost. And supposedly his grave was out there on some meadow, you know, the usual stuff. And one time we were, Russ Banks and people came down and said, hey, the old guy's there, Russ. And he went up there and said, oh, the old guy's up there. So I said, well, let me go and take a look, you know. I went, nothing, you know, no old guy. But, anyway, here's a poem. Ghosts. Is Mr. Brown looking much better than he did in the morgue? He brought me a huge carp in a blood-stained newspaper. What an odd visit. I haven't thought of him in years. Linda is with him, and so is Sue. Two pale and elegant fading memories holding each other by the hand. Even their lipstick is fresh, despite all the scientific proofs to the contrary. Is Linda going to cook the fish? She turns and gazes in the direction of the kitchen while Sue continues to watch me mournfully. I don't believe any of it. I'm scared stiff. I know of no way to respond, so I do nothing. The windows are open. The air is thick with the scent of magnolias. Drops of evening rain are dripping from the dark and heavy leaves. I take a deep breath. I close my eyes. Dearest specters, I don't even believe you are here, so how is it you are making me comprehend things I would rather not know just yet? It's the way you stare past me at what must already be my own ghost before taking your leave as unexpectedly as you came in, without one of us breaking the silence. Okay, this is now New Hampshire. President Bush is mentioned, but not the present one, but his dad. And this is a kind of backcountry poem. I live in a place of 300 souls, as they used to say in the old days. So it's tiny. It's called Pastoral Harpsichord. A house with a screened-in porch on the road to nowhere. The missus topless because of the heat. A bag of Fito Banditos in her lap. President Bush on TV watching her every bite. Poor reception, that's one advantage we have here, I said to the mutt lying at my feet and sighing in sympathy. On another channel, the preacher came chaperoned by his ghost when he shut his eyes full of tears to pray for dollars. Bring me another beer, I said to her ladyship. And when she wouldn't oblige, I went out to make chamber music against the sunflowers in the yard. Well, just a few more poems. This is a poem called Unmade Beds. And unmade beds are very interesting. In a hotel, you walk by and in the morning you're checking out and the room is open. Somebody's, there's a service. I mean, they're fixing the room, they're making up the beds and whatever, and you kind of peek, and they're pretty, incredibly tossed up bed covers up all over the floor. You said, my God, what a turbulent night there must have been. What did they eat or something? I had a friend, I won't mention his name, a poet friend who used to, before retiring from bed, he would eat a huge, late at night, he would eat a huge pepperoni pizza, and then would set the alarm clock after, tossing and turning, because, so you wake up and just write down these fantastic thoughts that the nightmares produced, by the pizza. So I'm talking about unmade beds like a species, the way you would talk about, well, if you talk about made beds, freshly made beds. So they is unmade beds, like, a species, there's a species of unmade beds. unmade beds. They like shady rooms, peeling wallpaper, cracks on the ceiling, flies on the pillow. If you're tempted to lie down, don't be surprised. You won't mind the dirty sheets, the rasp of rusty springs as you make yourself comfy. The room is a darkened movie theater where a grainy black and white film is being shown. A blur of disrobed bodies in the moment of sweet indolence that follows lovemaking when the meanest of hearts comes to believe happiness can last forever. I think I'm going to finish with this poem here. It's a poem called Serving Time, and the poem came from the phrase "serving time," and just kind of heard it for the first time. I said, "My God, we all are kind of servants of time, you know. We always serve somebody. I mean, poets serve the dictionary. They're servants of the dictionary." Joseph Brodsky used to say, but we all serve time. So here is a poem. I'm taking it literally, we're servants of time. Another dreary day in time's invisible penitentiary, making license plates with lots of zeros, walking lockstep counterclockwise in the exercise yard, or watching the lights dim when some poor fellow, who could as well be me, gets fried. Here on death row, I read a lot of books. First it was law, as you'd expect. Then came history, ancient and modern. Finally philosophy, all that being and nothingness stuff. The more I read, the less I understand. Still, other inmates call me professor. Did I mention that we had no guards? It's a closed book. Who locks and unlocks the cell doors for us? Even the executions we carry out by ourselves, attaching the wires, playing warden, playing chaplain, all because a little voice in our head whispers something about our last appeal being denied by God Himself. The others hear nothing, of course, but that, typically, you may as well face it, is how time runs things around here. Thank you. Thank you very much.